The future of news in a changing media landscape. Where to begin with this? I think, first of all, there's never been a more important time to discuss the future of news. In one sense, I suppose, if you're not necessarily a news junkie, you might feel that there's never been more news out there. So whether you're on Facebook, on Twitter, the news is there for you. If you're on Snapchat, if you're on TikTok, the news is there for you. If you're on WhatsApp, even if you're not on social media, if you're on WhatsApp, your neighbours will share. Have you seen this? Your mother will share, or certainly mine will anyway. Have you seen this? Have you heard about this story? So there's news absolutely everywhere. And that's before we even look at our own business, our own area, before we look at broadcasting, before we look at so-called traditional media, so the newspapers, before we look at online websites. The news is everywhere. And in one sense, that's fantastic. There's an appetite for it. People want to consume the news and they're interested in it. But in another sense, that's terrifying, because how do we get in there as broadcasters, as radio practitioners? How do we get a slice of that news market? And how do we make sure in the pantheon of news that's there, from, you know, whether people are talking about Danny Healy-Rae playing the accordion outside the Dáil this morning, or if they're talking about, you know, Meghan Markle or something else, how do we figure out what it is that they want and make sure that we deliver it in the right format? So that's the big challenge. And that's where these next four guys are going to answer all of the questions. So on the panel today, we have Anya Kerr. Anya is a teacher turned journalist, editor, lecturer, platform executive and entrepreneur. Now, if that doesn't make you feel like an underachiever, I don't know what will. Anya is also co-founder and COO of Kinzen, which is a technology company building personalization products for people and for publishers. That's a lot of P's. I should have watched that one. Anya also worked at Facebook and at Storyful, and also at a number of national newspaper titles as a political correspondent. And so you welcome Anya, please. Also today we have Damien Tiernan from WLR FM. Damien has a quarter of a century of journalistic experience and is now a news and current affairs presenter on the award-winning Waterford Local Radio. Damien will also be known to many of us as the former South East correspondent for RTE News from 1996 to 2019, and he was the second youngest correspondent ever appointed by RTE. So delighted to have you as part of the panel, Damien. Donny O'Sullivan is a CNN reporter who covers the intersection of technology and politics. He's part of the CNN business team and works with CNN's investigative unit, tracking and identifying online disinformation campaigns which target the American electorate. And he also covers how social media platforms, Congress and the American intelligence community are responding to the threat of disinformation and troll campaigns. Donny also terrified me earlier when he told me he's a Kerry native, and when I worked in Radio Kerry, Donny was at secondary school and remembers me on the radio from then, so it makes me feel very old. Come on, Donny. And finally, Emer Ní Bhraonáin, a communications expert with almost 20 years' experience in the media industry. I also worked with Emer a long time ago too. She cut her teeth in the regional press before moving to the national scene, where she worked as the Midlands and later South East correspondent with independent newspapers. These days you'll find Emer on KCLR knocking it out of the park, covering absolutely everything from football to hurling to sport, politics, a broad gambit. Emer, thanks very much for joining us. So I suppose to begin, guys, really the kind of things that we want to talk about is, you know, how technology, as it says on the box, what's the future of news? So how is technology impacting on the provision of news, the gathering of news and the presentation of news? And then how can we as radio broadcasters respond to that challenge and meet that challenge and give the audience what it is that they're looking for? So Anya, I might come to you first, just because you've you know, as an entrepreneur, you've ridden that wave where you've kind of predicted the audience trends in terms of news. And what do you see as the future? Where do you see news going? What are the audience demands for the future?
Yeah, so I guess if we look at what came before in terms of a perfect storm for this industry, we've probably endured 3 different revolutions during which everybody became a publisher. You know, we can all take out our smartphones, publish content across multiple platforms, and in that moment be a storyteller. So it's no longer the preserve of journalists and publishers and broadcasters. 2, the means of consumption over the last 20 years have drastically changed. Like, we think of our parents' generation, probably, you know, had a routine around news. There was maybe the alarm clock went off at 6:30, they woke up to the news, they sat down, watched the 9 o'clock news. And so there was a rhythm to their day when it came to consumption, habits, routine around it. And then thirdly, the modes of how news and information was distributed became hugely fragmented over the last 20 years. It was no longer, again, the preserve of your broadcasts on the 30 minutes, on the hour, your newspaper coming out the next morning. We now have multiple platforms, multiple apps, multiple experiences. And during all of that time, we heard a lot of mantras over the last 20 years of move fast and break things. It was a good mantra to some degree in that there was a lot of experimentation, a lot of creativity and innovation. But in that moment, our industry probably moved fast, yes, but we created a lot of content, and there was more content, it was faster, and it was everywhere as we tried to kind of work to these new algorithms, these new recommendations, these new platforms. And in all of that noise, we ultimately lost, I believe, the connection with people in this more faster content everywhere. And in the middle of that somewhere, we created what I would call a wicked problem. And a wicked problem by its very nature is often incredibly complex, contradictory. There's no one solution that's going to solve for it. And the wicked problem of our moment today is misinformation. But it manifests itself in many different ways around mistrust, manipulation, overload. And I've spent the last 2.5 years in Kinsen with our team, surveying thousands of people, sitting one-to-one with over 100 people, and trying to understand what are people's pain points, what are the problems that they experience in their day-to-day lives. And what we've learned is that people really feel that degree of mistrust. They no longer know what to trust in this massive, noisy ecosystem of news and information. They feel absolutely overwhelmed by the sheer volume of content available to them, and they're seeking to take back control. And that's the but. I've painted a very gloomy scenario in all of that. But I do believe that after all of that chaos and that move fast and break things, that we do as an industry find ourselves in a moment of correction, that we can realize the value of journalism as a social good, but we have to do things in a radically different fashion. And that means starting with the principle of public service journalism. What does it mean to actually solve for people's problems, people's needs, and build experiences that actually align with people's rhythm of their day, that actually gives them a sense of productivity with news and quality news, that gets them away from this endless scroll. I keep thinking I'm going to have arthritis in my thumb in years to come from just endlessly scrolling. So what does it look like, to answer the question, this can be a leap-off point to come back to, what does it look like if we start to build experiences that are productive for people, that are meaningful, that are relevant to their daily lives, but also challenge them? Don't let them go too far into their filter bubbles, that actually feel trustworthy, authentic, that is helping them find the signal in the noise, that is helping them get back a sense of routine and habit-forming experiences with news and information every day, and that we can actually build back trust within that. And so we have to think very, very deeply, what does it look like if we, the news industry, build for public service journalism that starts from the outside in, starts with people and build from there?
So we might come back to that point about how do we come back to there, but Donnie, to come to you on the point of misinformation or disinformation, that's your area of expertise, and it is a big one for journalists, that there was so much information out there that people weren't sure what to trust. So how do we get over that? And I think that the mantra fake news, I actually think we should not use that anymore. We shouldn't it should not be a phrase as part of public discourse, because it has done journalism a disservice, and it has done all of us a disservice, in that people go, oh, maybe it is fake.
Yeah, it's interesting, particularly about the phrase fake news, in that when it was sort of coined, I think in 2015, 2016, it meant misinformation. It meant actual false information that's spreading online. But then I think mostly thanks to President Donald Trump, he very much weaponized it, bastardized the term to make it be about CNN or news media.
You are fake news.
I am. News media that he doesn't like. But yeah, I mean, the job I do right now, I guess, didn't really exist 4 years ago. I think it was, everything that came out after the 2016 election about Russia and doing all this sort of stuff online on Facebook with these fake Facebook pages targeting Americans was a real wake-up call, I think, in the US, of how social media could be used in a way to manipulate people and to actually have a potential impact on elections. And I think it's only now, the first 2 or 3 years of that, 2017, 18, 19, a lot of the talk was, oh, what are the scary Russians doing, targeting, Mary in Alaska. But now we're starting to talk more about, I think, of how just domestic actors or even candidates for president are running misinformation campaigns. So I think it's good that the conversation is happening. Anya, to her credit, is trying to figure out solutions. But right now it looks pretty bleak from where I am. There's a lot of just blatant false information that goes extremely viral every day around very important issues, political issues in the US that people believe. When some of that stuff gets fact-checked by news organizations, the people don't trust those news organizations. And then there'll be another cycle of misinformation saying how this fact-check is part of a conspiracy. And I guess one thing that's sort of been worrying for me is that I think over the past few years, a lot of this stuff didn't make it to Ireland, thankfully. But now I think particularly over the past 12 months, and I don't follow what's the online sort of social space extremely closely online, but there is more of this sort of anti-vax bullshit creeping in here, the sort of stuff you see in Gemma O'Doherty's Twitter feed. I don't know all anti-defamation laws here, but the sort of stuff that you see on her Twitter feed, whether it's mistruths or just blatant falsehoods, and then that going viral and that sort of infecting more people.
But in a way, there's something a bit scarier about that, because that's not news that makes it into the mainstream. It's not news that's being reported by the mainstream, but it is facts that's been shared almost behind the media. Emer, do you have any experience of that kind of thing? And how can, do you have any thoughts on how broadcasters, as a radio industry, we can combat that kind of thing? Because sometimes it's seen that we're not relevant to that conversation if we're not addressing it.
I think we have to talk about the elephant in the room, and thankfully I can report a much more positive story, and maybe Damien Tiernan can as well, because the flowers or the roses, we can smell them in the regions maybe more so, because we have a lot of trust. Our listeners trust local, and our listenership is very high in the regions as well. I suppose we have our challenges, but with stories, I think if you leave them run underground almost on social media and don't find a way of talking about them and I know obviously we have restraints, we have to work within the restrictions, contempt and defamation and everything, but we have to address what's out there, because I believe that an awful lot of listeners now find, and it's borne out with election coverage and that the mainstream, maybe sometimes the bigger stations, are talking among themselves. It's like a cosy club. And they're not talking about the fact that people in towns and villages around Ireland were saying they were going to vote Sinn Féin, people who would have traditionally maybe voted Fine Gael. So these are the conversations we might have been having a little bit earlier on local radio. than just 2 weeks out before the election. So we were vox popping maybe 6 weeks before the election, and we were feeling we couldn't predict, for instance, the surge for Sinn Féin, but we could certainly predict that there was going to be a swing and that things were going to maybe shake up. We thought that the change would come maybe more slowly. So I think...
So the notion of local radio as the parish pump, the place where, you know, information is exchanged, that still exists because you're that close to the audience.
We're very close. Yeah, we're in this unique position. So people are really responding to original content, to stories that start kind of from their area. So the challenges are actually, I believe, much greater for international media. We can connect with our audience, and our challenges are more about distribution. So we can't rely on people turning on the radio anymore to hear us. We can't rely on people, I also have a newspaper background, people buying the paper anymore or turning on the television, the appointment to listen. I have to be in their pocket, on their phone. So therefore, when you're covering something like recently the general election, you need to be seen as well as heard. Your primary, obviously, product is radio. However, your radio, your television, your newspaper, and your more, all wrapped up into one. And the biggest challenge I have is actually not in local radio, is not fake news and threats from those outside external. It's more getting our story into your pocket and finding new revenue streams so that we can continue to tell our stories, because we can no longer rely on maintaining. You can maintain your commercial revenue, but if you're going to grow, you're going to have to find other revenue streams.
So, Damien, that notion of multi-platform, so it's not enough, you know, it needs to be in your ears, on your desktop, on your phone, so, you know, on all these platforms. What does that do for journalism? Does it enhance it, or what does it do for it?
You have to, as a journalist, envisage yourself not reconfiguring how you change your job and how you have to work 24 hours a day. You just have to do things differently. So you have to accept, and change can either happen in two ways, and RT is going through this at the minute. You can either change because you know things are really, really bad, and if you don't change, you're going to go down the Swanee, or you actually put a vision out and you say, this is where we want to go. So if you can convince your staff to work with you on that, you can then create content, that horrible word, content, because news is content anyway. But news, I think very simply, news will stay the same, no matter what. In 100 years' time, it's going to be the same. News is when the bus is late. The old Eddie List and some of the lads would know him, news editor in RTE. That's what news is. You go home, you'll say the bus was late. That's the first thing you'll talk about, bad news. They'll listen to you at the dinner table. They'll talk to you about that. And whether that's in Pakistan or whether it's in any place across the world, it's the same thing, local or national. The thing that comes into it then is trust. A couple of brief examples. There's a guy, Waterford's most famous tramp. His name is How Do. And he goes around saying how do to people on the street. He went into a nursing home recently. So we were on the air the other morning and somebody was putting up on Facebook. And you have to monitor Facebook and the feeds as you're doing your show. And that's how a program and a radio station can respond to social media. So the word was out that How Do is dead. So we literally fact-checked. All it takes is one phone call. Ring the nursing home. Is How Do dead? His name is Michael something or other. No, How Do is still fucking alive. He's still here. Sorry. So, like Mark Twain, he'd gone before his time, you know? So I put it out. I said, by the way, we've just checked, our news team have just checked, How Do is still alive. So we didn't put anything up on Facebook, but straight away somebody heard us. They then but they had buried him in 10 minutes. It had gone viral. And everybody in Waterford and different parts, because I even had it when I was in RT, I did a piece about the St. Patrick's Day parades, the god-awful St. Patrick's Day parades. And I started one of my pieces with How Do. And that's what news is. So it's about trust. So they trusted us to check the story. And we checked it, and we got the information out there. And I think that's going to be the same no matter where it is. There is a big, big pressure on media organisations now to respond to this growing clamour within social media, where people, like, if somebody's on Facebook, they're not going to go and ring the nursing home. They don't do that. They'll just put that out there, and they'll put out the abuse. And because Ireland's so small, the first person I met when I came in here today was a guy I'd never met before. He's my second cousin once removed. Ireland is so small. I love that second cousin once removed. It's so small. They think they know you. They think they can own you. They think they can criticize you. They think they can basically do what they want with you. And they expect you then to respond to them on personal messages and all that sort of stuff. Ooh, ah, up the blah, right? That's what he was supposed to say. That became a massive news story. We got slammed on the local, I'm actually hating the word local radio station. We're now going to be, and do you know what I mean? We shouldn't be just thinking local, we should be thinking national. How did Tip FM cover the Caroline Flack death? How did any of our local radio stations cover Caroline Flack? We got loads of criticism, either from Sinn Féin bots, as they call it, or people genuinely saying, you're not focusing on another story with Mary Butler and a Keneally thing with canvassing and Fianna Fáil and all that, again accusing us of being biased. We did our Sinn Féin story, David Cullinan, the one day, then the next day we do the Mary Butler. So they're all giving out about not covering the story, but then they're quiet when we do cover the story. So if you get, as a journalist, as a news content creator, upset because they're not recognising the fact that you've actually done your job, you may as well get out of the business. You can't sort of take it personally.
Okay, we know that the trust is there in radio broadcasting. We know that from the BAI Reuters Digital Institute research. And I suppose what you're talking about there is kind of an editorial call that a programme makes or that a show makes on a daily basis, and, you know, defending that call. But how do we make sure that what we're giving the audience, if they're interested in Caroline Flack, how do you navigate that? One day it's Caroline Flack, or 1 hour it's Caroline Flack, and 1 minute it's David Cullinan. How do you mine through all of the information that's there and make sure that you're giving them what they want?
Well, I know the others are going to come back on this very briefly. What we're going to do now, we're starting next week, we're starting for the first time ever a series of meetings. We're going to have 9 after 9. So a meeting at 9 minutes after 9, after the debt notices, because if you try to do a meeting when the debt notice is on, you may forget about it. You're going to have your news editor there, you're going to have your sales manager there, you're going to have your digital content provider there, and you're going to have your director of programming there and somebody from the programme. You're going to basically look at the topic for the day. So it may not be necessarily a local story, it's a story that everybody's going to be talking about. So effectively, when I was in RTE, I used to love driving past Kilsheelan, and you'd stop at the pub to see if the lads would stop drinking at 6 o'clock to see what's on the telly. If you can stop somebody doing what they normally do, if you can get a taxi driver to actually talk about what was the main news of the day. And geez, I heard this on WLR, right? So I heard the interview with the local social media person. You heard something to do with depression. You heard all the things got to do with male versus female abuse online. You get somebody from England. You own the story. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to do a second meeting at 2 o'clock. So you can think far more, and this was mentioned earlier in the first thing about the future of radio. You can think far more beyond your franchise area. And that's where it's going, because then you can own a story and you can spread it an awful lot more on different platforms.
I think social media, just to build on what Damien has said, has been really positive for local radio. Because when I think back to producing for Sue Nunn years ago, we used the golden pages, we used the telephone book, we'd randomly ring numbers in villages to see what was going on. So social media has actually made it so much easier. We can find anybody from the Taoiseach down. We get quick access to people, and it's also I keep an eye, obviously, with editorial. You have to really keep a close eye on all the comments all the time. So if you put up a controversial news story, you need to make sure. And we find, in the main, our listeners are amazing for balancing themselves out. So somebody says one thing, and before I need to get in there and say something sensible, somebody else has said it for me. So if you kind of step back and use it to your advantage, use it to signpost people to things, to drive your listenership, to increase your revenue, to get your message out. I think instead of us worrying about factors we can't control. People will always manipulate media, whether it's Facebook or it's newspapers or it's radio. You're always going to be dealing with that. So I think we need to use it for what we can get from it in radio.
I think I think what Damien mentioned there about obviously having a thick skin as a journalist, and probably thicker now in the age of social media, is that I don't think as journalists, we don't realize a lot of time that on social media, all the trolls and everything, oftentimes the purpose of these trolls and bots is not to change the mind of the general public, but to actually target journalists and reporters to help set an agenda. And then particularly, as you mentioned, during an election campaign, it's very easy for someone, a political operative, or somebody in their bedroom, to run 100 Twitter accounts and make it seem that they're all different people. And that, and I think if you're a 22, 23-year-old working, first job out of college in a radio station like that, that can have an impact on you.
That's pressure. That's a lot of pressure.
Yeah. So I think it's to be very mindful of that. And we talk a lot, I think, about all this social media stuff as it's a absolute new thing, and misinformation. But I guess it's almost 10 years ago now since Pat Kenny read out that tweet in the 2011 presidential election, right? That turned out to be a total falsehood. So it's been around for a while.
So if stories are the key and delivering the stories that matter to people, Anya, where do you see that fitting into the news agenda then?
Yeah, and I think that's an important assumption we should have as journalists who desperately care about journalism. I actually believe the content is good. Obviously, we'd like to do more investigatory journalism, but let's assume quality journalism survives and is thriving in different ways today. And I think what you hear from Emer and Damien today is that they are thinking about their community, they're engaging with their community by starting first with the citizen, and that is fantastic and to be commended. And I think what you hear there also is that they are using technology for good. I know there's been this massive backlash against technology and platforms, and absolutely right and proper, but technology has also helped us better understand the world around us. It has made people much more educated about the world around them, and has helped journalists find stories, obviously verify them, and be that human layer. So let's never forget that. Yes, we need technology to help us better do our jobs, find new stories, distribute stories, and monetize those stories, but we are always going to need a human layer on top of that technology. So let's take all of that as a given. If we are going to do public service journalism that, to Damien's point earlier, where in the morning maybe we care about the weather and the transport, and in the evening we care about Netflix recommendations. We know people have a really intimate relationship with radio in this country, but we have to start thinking about radio across all of the different mediums, thinking about the visualization, the visual stories of it, thinking about the podcast, thinking about newsletters. And to your point, Sinead, how do you make radio match the rhythm of people's day? How do you ensure that it is local and relevant and meaningful? So people's topics and interests, their profession, their location. And that's where there is still an opportunity for radio that is still untapped, I would argue. Because if I look at all of the research out there at the moment, as I talked about earlier, people are overwhelmed, there's mistrust, they feel manipulated, okay? The advertising model as we know it is broken. Well, what does the user, what do people, our audiences, our community want today? What all of the research shows you is that they want their news to feel personal. They want it to be curated, and they want to feel productive because of it. So how do you do that outside your programming and your bulletins as is now? Well, think about newsletter experiences. What does it look like to build personalized newsletters for people where they get to go in and have control over the topics, the things that are interesting to them? What does it look like if you as a publisher, though, can insert modules into those newsletters that is the editor's pick, that is the journalist's pick? So you're trying to get that balance between a newsletter that is very personalized to somebody, but you, the editor, can still say, but I'm going to challenge you here with some things rather than you go into your filter bubble. And that's what we think about every day in Kinsen. What does it look like if maybe you are a radio and a broadcaster and you have an audience, younger audience that is really obsessed with climate change, but you're just not doing enough climate change content every day, but you want to do this daily newsletter or this daily podcast of podcasts.
So are you talking about something there that's almost the opposite of the Facebook algorithm? So instead of giving you more of what you like,
Yes.
it gives you the opposite or the opposite of what you like,
So
and says, try this.
If we could imagine a scenario where we go from these hidden algorithms and instead build experiences that people control. And that's what we've been building in Kinsen, is this idea of a citizen algorithm. It's a piece of technology. We're plugging it into publishers for broadcasters. We're working with Manchester Evening News and a lot of other publishers around the world at the moment to say, here is a piece of technology, plug it in, and if you could imagine a personalised website with local radio stations, even here in Ireland, and rather than having to scroll through everything that's on that website, you're basically doing more of this, less of that, okay? So you're fine-tuning it to you, but still giving the broadcaster, the publisher, the ability to insert in a module, a box that's saying, but I'm going to challenge you here because here's the stuff you might have missed. So you're trying to kind of get that fine balance all the time. And what you're doing by building experiences like that is ensuring that it feels more productive. Yeah, this is meaningful to me. This is personalized. I own this. If it doesn't feel like me, I'm going to go over here to this button and I'm going to fine tune it again. But to my earlier point about, let's say, climate change and building experiences that do feel personalized to people, we as an industry have to think about that Netflix generation that are going into experiences now where they're finding content meaningful to them. They're getting recommendations, and suggestions, but it's feeling curated. So why can't we as an industry start to say, I'm not the expert in climate change. I am the expert in what is happening local to Waterford and Kilkenny. I'm going to build beautiful experiences around that. But if my audience want more on Caroline Flack or on climate change, I'm going to curate the best sources in the world into that experience. So at least you're building that one-stop experience rather than people feeling like they have to go to 30 different destinations every day. And that's the kind of thing we have to start thinking about, is matching the rhythm of people's day, giving them these personalized experiences while still giving the publisher control to insert in other content that is challenging, that is curated from around the world.
That's why context is important in local radio as well, because you don't want your listeners to have to go somewhere else. So you give them the unique stories, the heartwarming stories, the stories that are relevant to them in their areas, but you also have to tell them what Trump just said, what's happening across the water. You have to give them everything, basically. So I think that local radio can position itself to do that as well.
That is a challenge, though, because you have to give an awful lot.
Within your resources. Yeah.
Within your resources. So, like, if you talk us through a story, so you go to the scene of a story, something has happened, you have to take a picture, maybe a video, tweet it, send your story back. Sometimes the rush for speed, how does that impact what we're doing?
Well, it's storytelling. Journalism has always been like that. So the way I have always rolled is that local stories have a universal meaning. So your local post office closure, that could be relevant, to everybody in the world on one level. Rural decimation. You have to find a common denominator. You have to tell your story in a way that it could impact on anyone listening to you. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you need a team of international journalists behind you in a small radio station in Kilkenny. You just need to think on your feet. You need to be smart. You need to use humans to tell your story in a really engaging way. And as well, do you know what? People have a tsunami of stuff coming at them. They want to feel good as well. When they listen into you, they want you to put the best side out, to tell them, when you're talking about Brexit, are there any opportunities there for people? So it's just to kind of make your story stand out so that your story will travel further than anyone else's, because every story starts somewhere. So sometimes you might find the story that goes viral, it could be, for instance, we had an incident with a deputy mayor losing his chain, and when it suddenly he found it in his suitcase the other day when the deputy mayor's stint was over, the person to replace him. So I mean, small stories like that people can latch onto, and on the other side of the planet, somebody might be very interested in that. So it's getting your local story and capturing everyone's imagination.
Tony, we imagine in CNN that the resources are massive and the budgets are massive, but presumably the skills are exactly the same in terms of finding good stories and telling them in an entertaining way.
Oh, yeah, totally. We're probably a lot of people who are less skilled at CNN. I didn't say it. But
you can always ring the post office and knock negotiable.
Well, one thing which I think that the mainstream US corporate media has been very slow to and still trying to figure out is how on the fact checking of stuff, bullshit that's online. And as you mentioned about hoo-ha,
How do?
How do?
Hoo-ha.
The hoo-ha about how do. How do you do? But I think there's always, like, in my position particularly, I sort of cover a lot of how misinformation is going viral. But as part of that, then I will pass on to our political desk or our fact-checking team. I'll say, you know, there's this story today about Trump or about Bloomberg that is totally false, and it's actually millions of people are now seeing it. And they always have to have a big discussion of, well, by us going out there and debunking this, are we still drawing more attention to it than, you know, it deserves? Whereas I think, and particularly in Ireland with local radio, which everybody listens to, you know, I think there's a unique opportunity there for the sort of fact-checking. Because, you know, my dad's not on Facebook. He doesn't even text. But he works at a fish shop in Carsavine, and he'll have heard back town when he comes up home at lunch, or at the end of the day he'll be saying, you know, how do's dead, and we'll say, well, where'd you hear that? And he'll have heard it from somebody who read it on Facebook. So you know, even I think we think a lot of times when we think about social media, we think it's just, you know, the few people who are or the people who are actually online, but it goes beyond that. So yeah,
I think one important thing you do is training. So any media owner here today has to train their staff, and any journalist has to be trained properly. Why is that important? Because you have to garner all the different experiences and learn as you go. So learning is so important. That's why training is so important. Pay is very important. Local radio over the years has had crap pay. One of the things I went into and worked with the management within WLR, after 2 months we got a 10-12% pay rise for the staff. So straight away, there you go.
Hoo-ha.
No, but the reason is, listen, think about it. It's very, very simple. Through the NUJ and the Journalists Union, it's very important, because if ethics got to do with that, that comes into an awful lot of stuff. Every journalist should be in the NUJ. And also, it allows management then to say, right, we're working pay, we're making you happier, now we're going to instigate change. So the whole thing becomes a far better fulfilling, I suppose, parameter. Also, very simply, you can bring experience. So, for example, if I was going out in a news story, you'd send a quick picture, but then I used to turn off the phone for an hour. Imagine going out as a journalist, and I never told my bosses that, but turn the phone off because they're trying to get you, and you'll have 40 minutes, and turn off your answering machine as well. Never have an answering machine on your phone. Turn that off. If they want you, they'll get you again. Because in that hour, you can then go and collect all the information. You can get the story. You then come back, and they're waiting for you because they trust you as the source. So you can use that experience to get all the different stuff. Speaking of payments and payouts, RT's paid out loads of money over the years regarding the dump button. I couldn't believe it when I heard RT still doesn't have the dump button. God, you have to learn from experience, lads. Seriously, that dump button has to go in there. Because if we're going to be paying out another $250,000 or $500,000 payouts, that's license money, you know what I mean? That's our money. That has to be done. So all those experiences come into it.
Okay, so the funding then is a big important part. I know you were talking about pay, but I think in general, how are we going to fund the journalism? How are we going to fund the skill sets? Anya, where do you see that coming from? Because journalism is expensive. It's not that easy to do. I know a lot of people think that it's very easy to be a journalist. There does have to be some kind of a funding model for it. And if everyone feels that they can provide the news, how do we set it up as journalists and go, there does need to be some kind of a proper funding model here, and we can't have it sponsored?
Yeah, and so break it down a little bit, summarising some of the earlier points. Our responsibility is to make sure we understand the community that we serve, that we are actually relevant in our daily lives, that we absolutely fundamentally in the core of our existence can see how journalism is a social good. How does journalism better help them understand the world around them, but to understand who they are in our communities, okay? And then we have to think about, well, why does journalism matter? And we have done, frankly, a terrible job as an industry explaining why journalism is critical in people's everyday lives. We have made it as simplistic as buy the newspaper instead of a cup of coffee today, without explaining and amplifying the why journalism is important when it comes to decisions in your daily lives, like going to the polls last week. Like, how did journalism actually impact your life? So we have to do a better job of explaining the why. And then looking at the what. We have responsibility back to our community, that we are setting ourselves up in order to survive and thrive, because as we hear here today, community journalism, local journalism, even if you hate that word for now, is critical in people's daily lives. And so in order to do that, all radio broadcasters have to think of themselves as platforms. You have to think about, how am I going to become tech-enabled? And think about how, if the last 20 years you feel like you lost control a little bit of the relationship and the connection to the Facebooks and Googles and Twitters, how do you pull that back by building that meaningful, relevant content and making sure it matches the rhythm of their lives, and that you are finding people in the places that they are, from Snapchat to their email inbox, okay? So thinking about all of those different, and it's only then, when you've done all of that, you get to ask, and how are we going to ask people to pay for it? And right now, we cannot assume there is any one solution. We all know that. But we also have to work on the assumption that what has gone before in terms of this advertising-led model is broken. If people are telling us we feel overwhelmed, we feel we've been used, we feel like people want a digital detox, look at all the research. People are increasingly going into private messaging boards and getting off the public Twitter, Facebook platforms. People are doing digital detoxes. People are saying enough. But they're also saying we want quality, we want productivity, we want stuff that is personalised and curated. So you can only get to ask them to pay when you have built that. And so you have to look at a broad range of diverse revenue models. Everything from saying, yeah, I'm going to continue to be advertiser-led, but it has to stop being about time spent on my website and on my apps and on my experiences, to instead what Tristan Harris calls time well spent. That instead you are saying to people, it is enough to listen to our podcast, read our newsletter for 20 minutes on the dart today, and that's enough. And come and consume one advertisement as opposed to us throwing 5 at you. But what would it look like if that advertisement was actually meaningful to you, that was customized based on you opting in and saying, okay, I'm fed up of being tracked across the internet, but I will opt in to being served advertisements from my local radio station if it's actually meaningful to me, and I get the power to opt into that. So that's one. 2, look at, granted, the New York Times and the Washington Post models aren't for everybody in terms of that subscription-led model, but there's definitely green shoots of that working in other scenarios where it feels membership-driven, where it feels like you are joining a community, your community, and you're making a contribution, and that you're actually getting to contribute to it. Like Emer hearing from her community and hearing about their voter intentions and actually feeling a part of something. You are contributing to your radio station, and your broadcaster, your presenter is hearing that and disseminating that out, and actually there is a two-way conversation. People will pay for that feeling of belonging, that feeling of membership, but they will also potentially make donations. And the key thing in all of this, if you look at some of the Reuters research trends, the generation that may surprise us here is actually our millennial generation. They are the ones increasingly putting their hands in their pocket and saying, I will donate, I will subscribe, I will become a member, I will opt in for that advertising, or actually, in one case with Scroll in the US, I will pay to opt out of advertisements. I will actually pay you not to serve me advertisements. So we have to get creative with this and appreciate it's no one thing. We have to be diverse, but make sure we do the who, what, where, when, how, why first to get to the how.
Could I just say very briefly, sorry, because the topic is the future of news. How do I think we're going to survive, right? I think we need to leave, this spells out local, by the way. I think we need to leave the noise behind. We have to seek and exploit opportunities. So when you're talking about new revenue streams, so we have to build a big brand, and we have to do more than just radio. We need context in our stories, so we're all things to all people. Accuracy is huge, so if any of Damien's former editors were listening, he was right to turn off his phone for an hour, because they'd be screaming for a news line that could have changed within the hour. So accuracy is huge. And the last in local, in the word local, is local, because everything starts somewhere. So we're the original content creators. So start there and spread your message out. Our challenge now is distribution, just figuring out how do we get into people's pockets, but we're working on that.
Okay, and Damien, I'm going to put one last question to you before I throw it open to the floor for questions. And that's just in terms of, because news is everywhere and it's all around us, in a radio sense, we often think of news in terms of the bulletin at the top of the hour. And I guess the fact that it has already broken all over Twitter, Snapchat, or wherever, 40 minutes beforehand, does that mean going into the future that the bulletin is dead? No,
it doesn't. Advertisers will still value the bulletin, the top of the hour bulletin, and that's very important for radio stations. And I think that'll continue, because whether it's RTE, Today FM, they'll still want, okay, if I've missed it, they'll go at 10 o'clock. You have to create a space, though, within each media organisation to allow for journalists and staff within that to be able to broadcast before the top of the hour with integrity. But do you think that people actively come to the radio for the top of the hour? A lot of them do, yeah, especially for the deaths.
But for the news?
News is deaths is news. I told you, news is when the bus is late. You don't go home and say Mary's just been cured of cancer. You go and say Mary's got cancer. It's an awful thing to say.
I'm going to disagree.
Bad news.
I'm going to disagree with Damien, if that's okay, and we agree on most things. But I think that the traditional newsroom,
in Waterford we do anyway.
The traditional newsroom, apart from the border issue between Kilkenny and Waterford, the traditional newsroom is going to be extinct. So I think the top of the hour, we're going to see that changing in the next few years. The live, we heard it earlier on in previous sessions, the live is going to be the main thing, and we're going to all be out, and with just phones, videos, and an ability to assimilate all the information on the spot and somehow get it out on air, because we have to evolve and we have to embrace the technology, and that's how we'll survive, not doing things exactly as we have been doing them for years.
Right. Anyone on the floor got a question?
Break.
Shay Harford from Spirit Radio. Just touching on, first of all, what Emer said earlier about the social media comment, and then it's contradicted, i.e. the truth is in the middle, and what Downey said about fact-finding not being believed. It's another Irish behaviour pattern that don't let the truth get in the way of a good story. Do you find this type of thing challenging when delivering news to an Irish person? And if so, how would you face those challenges?
It is. It's very challenging every day, but the basics of journalism, you just have to sift through it. And first thing in the morning, you wake up and you go through your notifications. You have to weigh up a story. You still have to make phone calls. There's no shortcut, really. But if you're generating content, and if you can see everyone's talking about David Cullinan standing up and saying up the Ra, if that's what everyone's talking about, you're on the radio, you're connecting with your listeners, you're a vessel, you have to let the story out, but you have to do it in a way that's responsible and balanced. So there's no straightforward answer apart from good journalism. That's, I suppose, that you'll be able to cover those stories if you apply the same principles as you would to any story.
I will say that Ireland's at a point where it has a benefit over the US and probably the UK, in that, America is so polarized right now. You're on either one side or the other. And that sort of, the public was trained into that even before social media by the mainstream media of these sides. And so, it's sort of not polite to say in the US, but the French election, which I think was in 2017, Facebook put out some numbers, and they said, we actually saw a massive decrease in the sharing of disinformation, fake news, whatever, in France, and we think the policies we're putting in place will work in the US. But what I think they were forgetting was that France isn't as polarized, and people don't have that want to believe as much the bullshit. So I think at the moment, at least, when society is not as polarized, it makes things a little easier, which is what sort of scares me about seeing the creep of this crazy stuff coming into the social media space in Ireland.
Okay, we'll take one more question from the floor.
Thanks. Thanks, guys. A really good discussion. Wendy Grace, my name, also from Spirit Radio. I just wanted to connect up a lot of the things that you all touched on. I mean, Anya started off talking about public service journalism, and then it was really great to hear Damien and Emer just talking about getting back to basics, the beat on the street, and the difference that made, even Emer, as you were talking about kind of knowing the Sinn Féin swing a few weeks in advance, maybe national media. But as everyone has kind of touched on, really good public service journalism and investigative journalism, it takes time and resource. And some of the most, historic pieces of investigative journalism could take months, and I feel we have really a lot of tenacious, talented journalists that if we had the resources put into a lot of our local radio stations, we would have amazing investigative journalism. Bringing it back to our first session when we were talking a little bit about the public service broadcasting fee, I'm wondering, is there a case for a very concerted, consolidated effort in terms of lobbying, saying, every local radio station, etc., needs to be able to vie for funding that's solely put into public service and investigative journalism, because it's always going to be a lost leader. Do you have any thoughts on that? And would that be possible to get everybody working together on a campaign like that?
I think the IBI have been working very hard, and it's been tough because they've come so close to getting somewhere, and election promises made by Enda Kenny previously, and it making it into manifestos. We heard about that earlier, but it just hasn't materialised for us. It would make such a huge difference if the broadcasting levy was scrapped. I mean, you're talking about the difference. If you were able to employ an extra 2 people in a small newsroom like KCLR, it's incredible what you could do actually with it. And one of the biggest stories and the biggest scandals we've had for years in Kilkenny is to do with the Department of Psychiatry at St. Luke's. We chip away on our own time. We FOI, we ask questions of the HSE, but within your work shift, you're getting, in Spirit, you're getting your shows out. I do a 2-hour show every day, 10 hours of live radio a week, plus you're managing news, sport, current affairs. That kind of stuff you'd love to spend more time on. You actually can do an awful lot with very little if you box clever, but definitely, we need to get some of the pie, because we're providing content that people can't get anywhere else. And even in terms of sport as well, and the richness, the diversity, if people didn't have that content, they'd be screaming out for it, and there'd be much more pressure on the nationals to deliver it. So I think it's about time that local radio was properly funded, and we're very commercially minded, but we certainly wouldn't say no to any help in terms of public broadcasting funds.
And not specific to how you get funding, but 2 questions I would throw out are, one, what would it look like if local stations collaborated around some investigation pieces? Like, if you look at the precedents granted at an international level of the Panama Papers, if you look at First Draft, what they're doing around elections across different countries, there is precedent for this news industry starting to collaborate rather than compete, because the goal is the same at the end of the day in terms of producing good stories. So what would it look like to collaborate with some of your competitors, 1? And 2, and this is maybe not specific to how you think about programming, but maybe website and churning out a lot of stories. Well, what does it look like to say less is more? That maybe you don't have to produce X number of stories, that you could decrease it by 20%. Look at what Tertius Media are doing in London, where they're saying we're going to do 5 stories every day, and that is it. We are just going to give people enough to feel informed about the stories happening today. Look at Day Correspondent as another model doing that. They're doing particular beats and just enough stories rather than feeling the pressure to continually feed the beast and the monster. Just 2 things to think about in terms of maybe 1, efficiencies, and 2, to do something a little bit creative.
Okay, very briefly, Damien, because we do need to wrap it up.
I know people are hungry. Very simply, I can't believe how independent radio stations survive. It's unbelievable. On advertising alone, it's phenomenal. I haven't come from RTE. It's just amazing how people do their job and survive. It really is. With that, there should be more money, 100%. The investigative stuff would be very, very important. It would be great. I think the future of news is a combination of what Anya's been talking about, that personalised thing that's going to come on your phone, let's say 5 years' time. You're talking about some radio stations now, like newspapers, having paywalls. If that becomes a personalised paywall, are you going to pay for €5 a month to have the personalised news delivered to you by trusted sources as a combination of local and national? So there could be more collaboration between local and national services. I would see that happening. I would see a greater, I suppose, configuration of how news is actually created and the news content. So that may mean, again, all this comes down to power. comes down to who owns news and who owns and controls the news. And Trump has been trying to do that in the States. And that's going to come in here as well. It will come here. It's going to happen here as well. So I think as media organisations, we have to be aware of that, and we need to have to call it out as well and say, this is not right. If we think it's something morally wrong, we need to be able to call it out.
Okay, thanks very much. Anya, Damien, Donny and Emer, thank you very much for your time, and thanks everyone for your attention and your questions.